thank you for joining us for today's webcast. I'll start off today by just telling you a little bit about myself. So my name is Amanda Teschko. I'm a business intelligence and analytics consultant with Thorogood. And I've been working for Thorogood for a number of years now on enterprise business intelligence strategies and implementations. And I'm joining today's webcast from our Philadelphia office. I did want to start today by just sharing a bit about this series with you. So this event has really been inspired by many conversations and projects I've engaged in over the past few years with customers who are looking to devise a business intelligence and analytics strategy that could really enable their organizations. I think really in any comprehensive business intelligence and analytics strategy, there really requires careful consideration and orchestration of things like tools, data, people, and processes so that you can contribute valuably towards your business objectives. And so we will cover these topics across 4 different sessions. The first session of the series will be today, and that's on considerations for front-end tool selection. If you are interested, though, in signing up for future sessions, they will be available for registration on our website in the next couple of days, and you would register at thorogood.com/events. With that said, I'll start today with a focus on tool selections and really share the necessary considerations for fashioning an enterprise tool strategy that is both robust and sustainable enough to meet the evolving business and technology landscape. So our agenda for today, it'll be a 30-minute session, so it'll be pretty quick, but I'll start with a little bit of background about Thorogood just to give you some context. Then we'll talk about the evolving landscapes with front-end technologies and really the way that user needs are evolving alongside that. We'll take a look at some common missteps that we've seen customers make when considering a front-end tool strategy. And then I'll share 2 sample approaches with you that we've taken with customers to really help shield against some of those temptations that we'll talk about, and really in the aim of providing them with a meaningful tool selection process. So for those of you who don't know Thorogood, we are an independent global professional services firm specializing in business intelligence and analytics, strategy, solutions, and services. As you can see, we've been doing this for a little over 30 years now. We are a global company, so we have offices in London, New York, Philadelphia, Singapore, Sao Paulo in Brazil, and also Bangalore in India. And we do offer a full range of BI and analytics services, including strategy and roadmaps, which is what we'll be talking a bit about today, but as well as full implementation, so everything from requirements through to implementation, as well as training and support. And I think you'll see this today as I walk you through some of our sample approaches, but our philosophy at Thorogood is really strongly rooted in ensuring that any BI and analytics solutions are delivered in a way that gives careful consideration both to the breadth of technical possibilities, but also a real kind of strong guide by business goals and value delivery. And you'll see that kind of permeate through a number of the different approaches that we share today. We do work with a number of blue chip customers, really drawing from a range of sectors. The sectors we most commonly work with are consumer goods, pharma and life sciences, financial services, and insurance. And I've listed a sample of some of our customers here. And we are an independent consultancy, and in that I mean that we work with a range of technology partners. Our consultants are all knowledgeable and experienced in a wide breadth of technologies and really in the way that those technologies can be integrated successfully. And I think you'll see in some of the points today where that element kind of helps with some of these strategies and roadmaps. I've listed some of our partnerships here, and this includes some back-end, front-end, and analytics-driven technologies that we work with. So now that you have some context to my background and what Thorogood does, I wanted to start the session today really by setting the stage a bit about the evolution of front-end tools and how that's impacted user needs. If we start by thinking a bit about different reporting needs, and we think about it on a bit of a continuum. So we may have something like this where we have our kind of consumer on the left-hand side and your most advanced analysts or maybe your data scientists on the right side. On the left, we may find that we have more descriptive analytics. And you can think of this as your traditional productized BI solutions. So this may be pretty structured reporting. It may be operational in nature. These may be kind of pixel-perfect types of reports and generally focus much more on consumption than on analysis. So little in regards to filtering, much more about kind of the presentation of information. And for these reports, we typically find that they have a pretty large, broad user base within our customers. So reports might be distributed to a large number of people within your organization. Then as we start to shift to the right, we have more diagnostic types of reporting. So you can consider this things like more ad hoc analysis for users of products like Tableau or maybe ClickView or Power BI. That's where a lot of this functionality may come into play. This type of reporting gives you the ability to really slice and dice the data, so using different filters, potentially pivoting the information in a certain way or allowing users to create their own charts or diagrams. And you may find that there are fewer users within the organization who are doing this potentially, though we do see that really this type of analysis is becoming much more of the norm for a number of our customers, really in all areas of the business and within all roles. And then on our far right, we've got our predictive or more prescriptive analytics. And you can think about this as more of mathematics-based, maybe statistical modeling. This is where your data scientists probably reside in the organization. And they may have different needs as well. They may need to create their own data sets in order to run regressions or to be able to visualize different distributions. And we tend to find in organizations that this is a much more niche user base because it often requires quite a bit of back-end or background knowledge and understanding in statistics. But I think the important part on this slide is that we can't necessarily think about these different groups, either of reporting or of user bases, in terms of discrete buckets. It's hard to really kind of neatly classify people or reporting types into those groups, but it's much more of a continuum with users and reporting falling at the points I've listed here, but also at many points in between. And so the reason I kind of use this to set the stage is because when considering a suite of front-end tools for your organization, it's important to consider how do we cater for these groups, but also all of the kind of shades of gray or varying bits in between. And I think if you think historically about tools for a moment, and historically being, say, 10 or 15 years ago, tools were really a little bit simpler at the time, I would say. So to be honest, I think tool considerations across different user bases were a little bit easier to do, and that's really because the front-end tools were maybe a bit more primitive or a bit more siloed. So you may have maybe 10 to 15 years ago, tools that were fitting into these buckets pretty easily. And generally, we'd find that today they're much less discrete. So where it may have made sense then to think about a suite of tools available within those discrete buckets. So, for example, SAS will be used for the data scientist, or TM1 will give to anybody who needs to do analysis. What we're seeing is that this discrete view of it has changed quite considerably as a lot of these tools have evolved. If we think about today, what we're finding is that front-end tools have evolved quite a bit, and that really creates more shades of gray along the spectrum. We're seeing that reporting, analysis, and statistical capabilities are really starting to converge in the tools. So instead of having set tools for each of them, we're seeing flavors kind of come into play. And fast following that, we're seeing that users' capabilities are beginning to converge as well. If we think about some of the tools available today, if I've put a couple of them on the top of the screen there, if we think about, say, Power BI, for example, that's a tool that you may think can fit neatly into the diagnostic category, but when you start to think about some of the features that are evolving there, your definition of it may change a bit. If you think about one piece of functionality that's available in Power BI is that users can now create R visuals. What that allows users to do is write and execute R script to perform algorithms on data sets that are stored in Power BI and to visualize the output of that. So when you start to think about it in that aspect, you're starting to blur the lines a bit between what's diagnostic and what's prescriptive. I'm also working with a customer at the moment in Power BI on a series of executive dashboards that have very little interactivity and are shared with a pretty large number of executives that may kind of fall more towards reporting. So we're seeing a bit of a blurring effect across those aspects. It's harder to kind of say nowadays that Group 1 should use Tool A and Group 2 should use Tool B with no crossover and no exceptions. And I think, what we're seeing as these tools evolve is that the user's abilities are evolving alongside of them. Organizations are having to ask themselves not just what tools does the organization need, but who can use them, who will use which aspects of them even, and really, how do you govern them? It's great that, your kind of everyday analyst can now create their own R visuals in Power BI and evolve their capability, but do you want them to? Should they be able to? Do they need to be certified in it in some way? And so I think what was traditionally a reasonably straightforward exercise of working out the front-end tools that are necessary to meet these business and user needs is not quite as straightforward anymore. It requires a little bit more sophistication. And so I think what really kind of goes along with that is the need for a strategy for selecting, adopting, and governing front-end tools that evolves as well as these tools and users are evolving. which I think leads nicely to our next section, which is really on avoiding some common missteps that we've seen customers make when selecting tools. And so I thought I'd lay some of these out for you here. So the first one I'll talk to you a bit about is making a decision by means of pure feature comparisons. So you may ask, what do I mean by that? We're asked all the time, kind of as consultants, pretty straightforward questions of, what is better, Qlik or Tableau? Or Tableau or Power BI is a popular one nowadays. And the answer really is always, it depends. So you can find websites that will compare tools based on, say, the types of charts that they have or reviews of the user experience, et cetera. And I'm not saying you shouldn't look at those, but they only tell a very small part of the story. Many of these front-end tools are also evolving very quickly. So a simple checklist may reveal that Power BI, for example, doesn't have a feature that Tableau has. However, if you look at Power BI a year ago versus Power BI today, it's a very different tool. The release cycles are much more rapid on some of these newer front-end technologies. And so if you look more holistically at the direction of a product, that will often give you a better gauge of if it's a worthwhile road for you to go down and may prevent you from excluding a tool based on what might be a rather minor gap in feature functionality that may be closed or changed in the future. And I'll say every tool will really have strengths and weaknesses, so looking at just a list sometimes makes it too much of a quantitative exercise. But if you look at features and create checklists, people can a lot of times fall into the trap of being drawn to flashy or new features without really rooting the decision of which technology to use in something that's more concrete. And that really kind of leads to the next point, or the next area that we've seen people struggle a bit with, and that's we've seen people fall into the trap of trying to select a tool without clear or well-understood business objectives. And to be frank, we will find, that many times IT organizations in particular may be looking at tool selection without having a clear sense of all of the more kind of detailed business objectives. Sometimes this may be because they are thinking about all of the other elements that they need to consider. They're wondering how will that tool work from a maintenance perspective, from an adoption perspective, what are the licensing costs of it? And those are all very important elements, but without understanding what the business is looking to achieve, it really won't matter how easily it fits into their service offerings that the IT organization is providing. And so I think ensuring that any analysis of tools is really rooted in key business use cases or key business needs is pretty important. And we'll look in the sample approaches some ways that you can try to keep your process rooted in the business objectives throughout. Next on here is evaluating a tool without considering complementary tools or the holistic solution. So what do I mean by this? I think there are kind of two elements to it. Oftentimes we'll see that companies think it may have to be tool A or tool B that they select, which is better, Tableau or Qlik, for example. Or they may decide that there's no one tool in their organization that provides them what they need, so they go out there kind of looking for that holy grail of a tool that can do it all. And I think that what we found is that many large organizations who are putting in these enterprise solutions do have a legitimate need for multiple tools. And I know that can cause some some more challenges from a maintenance perspective or how those tools get provided out to the business. But I think with clear direction on how the tools get used, when you use them, what gaps they're kind of fulfilling, a solution like this can still be governed and maintained appropriately. So I would kind of caution against going into any selection thinking there is kind of one holy grail answer or there is one technology that we can use and we can't think about the way those technologies might interact with each other or different front-end tools might be very complementary towards each other. We've also seen situations here where front-end tool selection is really considered without giving proper consideration to the underlying data foundation. So, for example, Tableau is a pretty phenomenal, wonderful tool, but certain types of data sets will work much better with it. And if the front-end tool selection isn't considering what the tool will sit on top of and how well it integrates with what already exists, that can cause customers sometimes to invest in a technology and then struggle to realize the full value of it, or to feel that the vendor kind of sold them something that doesn't actually work the way it was sold to them. But if you consider kind of holistically how that front-end tool fits into your end-to-end solution, that will cause you to be in a much better solution and to put you in a much better position to kind of be successful with the end product that you get. The next one is kind of a big one for me because I've done quite a bit on user adoption over the last few years. But I think oftentimes we see that user adoption can be a bit of an oversight or an afterthought, and not just about how usable is the tool, but what will be required, what sort of change management, what sort of empowerment programs are necessary to ensure that any technology that's selected, or if multiple technologies are selected, that users are really kind of empowered to use them appropriately. And so I think considering that as part of your tool selection process should be really important, and not to make it so simple as saying, we'll take the simplest tool because the training will be the least, or we'll take the most complex tool and invest a ton in training, but to just have a vision and a plan for how it will work. How will the tool work for different users? How will you go about getting people to adopt it and use it wisely? I think the more you can kind of consider that through the tool selection process, the better you guard against the risk of ending up with a tool that's kind of unworkable. The next one I have is really around kind of making a cost-based decision, and I would say that many times cost-based decisions are warranted. I mean, you only have the budget that you have to spend, but I think sometimes people will forget to factor in things like ongoing costs or the maintenance of a solution, the support, cost to train users, etc. Sometimes people will make a choice for a cheaper tool only to find that they need to purchase more tools down the line, or the investment in training is very high, or they need to completely change the back-end approach that they're taking to be able to work with the tool. And so I think it's important to just think holistically about the cost considerations, not just about licensing costs, but making sure that you're kind of thinking about all angles of it. And then lastly, I think I just have a note about resiliency. I think something that's kind of worth being upfront about is that these front-end tools do change, and they change pretty rapidly today. I think the best bet is usually to invest in some sort of data platform that can be leveraged by multiple tools to prevent against one tool becoming obsolete or another tool kind of becoming more appealing to a company. Some tools may allow for that better than others. Qlik, for example, which is a tool that I kind of love the front-end experience of, we have seen examples where customers might put a lot of business logic into the script engine in QlikView, which is kind of proprietary to QlikView. And then that logic can't be leveraged by other tools. So you start to go down a path with it that draws you into only being able to ever use one technology. I think if you can consider the resiliency of your solution from the get-go, it gives you the ability to think more realistically really about how these tools will evolve and the position that you'll be in when that happens. So now that I've talked about all of the things that kind of can go wrong, I'm going to share a couple of approaches that we've used with customers that really look to kind of mitigate some of these risks and to ensure that we're kind of focusing on the areas that I think need focus through a tool selection process. So with that, the first approach we will look at, I'll give you a bit of a spoiler here, we'll look at kind of scoping, prototyping, and some tool decision trees as the means to kind of helping them get to a solution. So just a little bit of background to where this approach was used with a customer. This was used with a Fortune 100 company that was really using a range of different front-end tools and had a lot of different user types, but they had somewhat limited understanding of the different use cases for reporting needs. So this was an organization that I would say was trying to select a tool but hadn't necessarily collected all of the business requirements or saw that as a bit of a daunting task to understand what every type of user might need. They did know that they needed to define a set of tools that would be maintained by central IT, and they knew that it wouldn't be just one tool to do every job, but that they would have to consider a combination of tools to work with their existing back-end platform that would be able to enable an entire organization. And they also really wanted to be able to provide guidance to users on when to use each tool. So they had started down this path a bit haphazardly and found that users were sometimes selecting the tool they were most comfortable in, and at times that would cause them to start trying to build something or do some analysis in a technology that wasn't really going to work for them. And so I'll just share some kind of screenshots in this approach side on the right of, what we kind of did with this customer to help get to a strategy for their front-end technologies. The approach we used here was really to start with a bit of a research, so understanding kind of their current state and needs. That meant understanding what the tools would be sitting on top of, understanding the user types, and get to kind of a shared vision with them. So, what was reasonable for them to be able to maintain, what technologies might be in scope, which ones didn't we even want to consider. Then we did a little bit of a gap analysis. Where did gaps exist between where they were currently and where they wanted to be from a front-end reporting perspective? We moved then into a scoping phase. So I think in this, we knew that it was going to be important to create some prototypes in the different technologies so that we could really understand how the users were liking working with them. In the scoping phase, what we did was we went to different areas of the business and defined use cases that would kind of run the gamut on the different needs that users might have. And we selected, I think, about 4 or 5 of them, if I remember correctly, to then create prototypes on. So we created prototypes in those technologies, we iterated on some options, and then we collected feedback from the users to see how was it kind of working in practice for them. And then that kind of resulted in a bit of a roadmap, so where we defined an action plan to move from where they were today to being in a position where they had not just these tools in place and working, but the users kind of mobilized to be able to use them appropriately. Then what we did was kind of looked at the different user needs and visualization deliverables. And this is kind of just a somewhat generic mapping that we use. It's not kind of black and white, but gives you a sense of the different types of needs and the different types of elements that may be needed to meet those needs. And we started to identify those use cases and plot it to this group, so that we could, what we really looked to do is ensure that the use cases kind of covered the full scope of what we needed. Some of the use cases spanned multiple visualization deliverables or user needs. Some of them were kind of individual, but we wanted to make sure that those kind of green boxes at the bottom like really covered the full breadth of it. And then I've blurred this out a bit here so you're not too distracted by it, but what they really wanted to get to was a bit of a decision tree that could help guide users through training in what technologies they should use. So once we got through the prototyping and came to a recommendation, we've helped them put together a bit of guidance for users that kind of had them answer simple questions and direct them to kind of through this flow chart here to work out which technology might be best for what they need. And this, again, is more guidance. It's not a black and white, it has to be done this way, but we found it pretty helpful for users to just have a sense of, the path that they should be headed on so they don't start with something that becomes unworkable. So that was the first sample approach. Hopefully you can see where some of those common kind of missteps were kind of avoided in the approach that we laid out. In the second one, we'll look at a slightly different approach for another use case. This was done for a member of a large multinational conglomerate. And really they were evaluating how a particular new front-end technology would work within their existing technology landscape. There was consideration for replacing an incumbent front-end technology. So there was a bit of, could we replace technology A with technology B, or do we need both of them? And what they were really looking for was some strategic guidance on how to provide a front-end offering that would work for users, but was still in line with their strategic vision. What we did here, somewhat similar approach, but we really looked to kind of do this prioritize, analyze, recommend approach. We started by really agreeing what the required capabilities are. And you can see I've kind of bolded there, but the key here was to root all of the requirements and business needs. And I'll show you the mechanism we did to try to do that. We then looked to prioritize those capabilities with the business, so how important were they? But also to agree what the pervasiveness of them was. Though it may be a very high priority, if it was something that would only exist in 1 or 2 reports or 1 or 2 people needed it, we may consider it differently. So kind of prioritizing on those 2 axes was pretty valuable in this case. We then analyzed a couple different solutions. So would it be 1 technology, 2 technologies? And did a bit of an assessment to see how well those technologies stacked up against the agreed and prioritized requirements before we went into kind of recommending a way forward. And that way forward considered not just the steps they would need to take to get to that point, but also any kind of cost, that holistic cost view, so licensing, implementation, and adoption. And like I said, the key to this was really making sure that the requirements were driven by the business goals, but with a firm understanding of what the technical possibilities were. And so we really kind of orchestrated those conversations there to make sure that that was kind of happening in the way that it needs to. And the approach we used for that, this is just a sample of one of the types of forms we used, but we had different kind of topics, a definition of what that topic was. We were then documenting business examples or business use cases for where they thought they needed those topics, and then the requirements and a prioritization. And I think what we found as we did this was that a number of topics they thought they had listed on their requirements, but when we drove for real kind of business examples of where that would be needed, so where they needed to do data mining, for example, we found that it was a bit harder to identify. And so that helped us not necessarily to keep things in scope or remove them from scope, but just to work on the priority of it and to consider what tools might work in which aspects. And then this last one I've got here just shows once we kind of collected all of those requirements, then we started to do that analysis exercise where we helped grade not based on the features that are available, but how well the features available in that technology would work in the context of the full solution and in light of the business requirement that they have. And that gave them a sense of, where the two options worked and how they may kind of use either one technology or both technologies. So I'll leave you there. I'll wrap it up a bit. Just some of the things we looked at in this pretty kind of brief session were a consideration for how the evolution of tools and user needs may impact the tool selection process. We took a look at some of the common missteps and ways that you may be able to avoid them, and considered some of the approaches that might help guard against common missteps and keep decisions really aligned with business value. And as I said, this is the first in a series of 4 elements. So if you are interested in understanding a bit more about how you manage the data behind these tool sets, that will be the next session that we're doing. That'll happen on March 28th. We'll then move to kind of an element on empowering your users or getting greater adoption on April 26th. And then we'll talk a little bit about process, so organizing and governing BI and analytics on May 24th. Please do feel free to go on and register for these events. I think the registration links should be available within the next day or so. And we'll also reach out to you to give you the full listing of these if you are interested to join to see the full series. So that is all the time we have for today. Do feel free to reach out to me either through email or through my phone number if you have any questions. I'd be happy to follow up with you. Thank you so much for joining today, and I hope you guys have a good day.